So to get started, we do have a few intro slides that I think cover more of the research symposium at large. So Jen, if you want, I'm assuming this is just to discuss the 2018 SRS locations this upcoming year?
Yes. So just to let you know, this is just a summary slide of where each of these are taking place. We have our first one coming up in April, so I feel like that's pretty soon. And the locations are here. The first one is in the Southeast at the University of North Carolina. I know Mike Jabot is on the phone, and so he is the one doing the one in the Northeast. He is the leadership team there. And we also have one at NASA Ames. We have one in the Midwest at Wayne State University, which is going to be at the School of Medicine in Detroit. And then the one in the Northwest is in Montana State University. And I did skip over the one in the Southwest. I see Rich Wagner is on the line, and he's the leadership team for that. So thank you for reminding me. That one is going to be at in Boulder, actually. So we need to update that slides because that one will be in Boulder and have some really cool tours included. So if you want to go to the next slide. We have a lot of resources for teachers. We just updated our science practices pages. So if you go to the Student Research Symposia web page, the landing page, you'll see a whole list of different subpages. And one of them is teacher resources. And what we did recently is we took the science practices, which are all of the resources and the webinars that we've been doing for the past 3 years now, and we put each of those resources on its own separate page. So for instance, we have a page specifically for research questions, and then we have a page specifically for data analysis. And we've brought all of those resources that we have together under those pages. So I think that's an improvement on the site in terms of providing an organized structure for all the resources that you have available for the Student Research Symposia. We also have a teacher hotline, and that is staffed by teachers that have that have participated in the SRS before. And if you're new to this, these teachers have offered to answer your questions about what it's like or how they've supported students. And we have a short Google form where you fill out your grade level that you teach and what the nature of your question is. And then we match you up with a teacher who can answer your question. And we're really encouraging that that be a brief phone call. You can go back and forth over email, sometimes 10 times, but sometimes a brief phone call can do it for you very quickly. We also have a teacher listserv. If this is the first time you've attended, you're not receiving our emails about these events. We do have an SRS teacher listserv, and we're sending out updates and deadlines and links and resources through that listserv. So we have that link. It's on the SRS webpage.
Okay, thank you, Jen. So the agenda for today's webinar is fairly brief. We just want to discuss poster presentation and how you should structure that. Clarice will be handling that. I'm going to just go over the Globe SRS presentation rubric and rubrics in general as a way to help support your presentation structure. Then we'll cover some do's and don'ts for giving poster presentations and some tips for preparing, and hopefully leaving lots of time for Q&A.
Great. Hi, everyone. My name is Clarice. And when I approach thinking about posters, I like to rely on this quote I heard from a high school English teacher one time, who told our class, "Our minds are made for stories." And that's really stuck with me, not only in I'm most comfortable conveying information through storytelling, but also I receive information through storytelling, because stories give us a way to relate to the content that's being told to us, but also we're used to that format. And so when I started kind of my journey into science communication and thinking about how to come across in my poster presentations, since they're kind of a conversational space, I really like to think of giving a poster as telling a story. So really thinking about what makes a good story. So we're going to focus for a little bit on thinking about the structure of a poster and explaining what students did through a project as telling a story. So key to any presentation is preparation. And Kiley is going to speak a little bit more concretely about preparation strategies, including practicing and editing posters later. But I really wanted to get us thinking about prepping in terms of thinking about the purpose of why we're presenting and thinking about the audience. These are kind of the same, two sides of the same coin, since they inform each other. So when I approach thinking about how I'm going to convey my poster, I really want to start with, like, do I want to describe something I did? Am I informing my audience? Do I want to persuade them of something? It really depends on kind of key takeaways of the poster, because that will set the tone that you're going to have when you are presenting a poster. I find it is best, since poster presentations are short, to keep it simple. You really want to focus on 1 to 3 key points, because in 3 to 5 minute time span, trying to jam in several points is just going to overwhelm the person that you're trying to convey this information to, but also you're going to be flustered. You're going to talk too fast. You're not going to explain things too thoroughly. So you really want to hone in on just a few key points. And one way to kind of whittle down what those points are going to be is thinking about, what do I want people to walk away from my poster knowing? Like, if they can only know 1 or 2 new bits of information, what do I really want them to have in their pocket after they're done talking to me? And I structure what I'm going to talk about around what I think that take-home message should be, trying to keep it simple and focused. Also, in preparing, I really try to think about the audience. Depending on where I'm presenting, who the audience is going to be very different. It may be other students, but they might not all be from my discipline. It might be faculty who are very specialized in what I'm doing, and I would approach that presentation differently for those 2 audiences, because their level of knowledge and interest is going to be different. When we think about audiences, one thing I really try to get across is, why should they care about your topic? What's interesting about it? What's unique about it? Did you approach solving a problem in a new way? Why should this person be engaged with what you're doing? So moving forward, thinking about how to craft the narrative about the project that you completed, purpose and audience really work together and can help set the tone and really focus you in on the key things you should be talking about in your presentation. So getting in a little bit more to how you structure what you're actually going to say, I like to think back to good old story arc that I thank my middle school English teacher for arming me with to take throughout my life and find some parallels to. So thank you, Ms. Pace, for that one. But I think there's a lot of analogies between the story arc that you learn in literature classes and how you can structure moving through the sections of your poster as you talk about them. So like the introduction of a story, when you're starting out delivering your message, you really want to make sure the audience understands the what, the why, and the who. What is your research question? And why did you want to study that? That gets back to what is interesting and why should they care about what you're doing. And really importantly, in this introduction, like any good story, we bring in the characters. And in this case, characters are going to be the variables or the data you're working with. Are you studying snowfall or snowpack? Were you looking at oxygen in a stream? Were you looking at distribution of different frog species and making sure it's really clear what you are working with through this project? Moving into the next part that you're really going to want to arm the audience with so they understand is your methods, kind of your rising action. Now that we've posited this question and this problem, how did you approach that? How are you going to work to study or answer that question? What's your plan? And how do all of those characters come into this plan? How did you use that data? So really being clear about now the how in conjunction with the what, the why, and the who. And the big kind of panache for any poster is your results. People want to know, so what now? We have this question, what did you find out? And this is a moment where it's really important to think about the distinction between showing and telling. You have this big, 3x5 foot poster behind you for a reason. And I always think it's more powerful to show your audience what you're saying than to just tell. If you can verbalize a result and refer back to something they can look at, they can not only attach themselves and kind of rationalize what you're saying through your words, they can see it displayed in front of them. And it makes that take-home message even more powerful, so they can internalize that information in a couple different ways. We begin to kind of wrapping up your poster. I like to think of your discussion as kind of that following action. Now that we know what we found out, what does it mean? How do your results fit into a larger context? And how may they connect to other related data or into larger themes around your research question? And then finally, your conclusion, kind of that resolution everybody looks for in a story. So now that we know this answer, what does it mean? Like really coming back to, you told them what you're going to tell them, you told them, and then you reminded them what you told them. And not only do you want to reinforce your main point in this resolution, you also want to open it up. If you were to have more time on this question, where would you want to go with future research? Or what would you suggest for the next group of students coming through and doing a related project to further what you've done? So structuring your poster presentation is really important, but so is delivering it effectively. You can prepare all of the good nuggets of your poster as thoroughly as possible, but if you don't deliver the information effectively, the person that you're talking to is not going to walk away with a clear picture of what you wanted them to know. So it's really important to kind of bookend your presentation with a strong introduction and a strong conclusion. We start strong and we finish strong. So when you start off your poster presentation, you really need to take that time to set the tone. Again, what is the purpose? Are you going to inform them of something? Do you have a stance on opinion that you're going to try to persuade them of? So we need to set the tone. You also want to try to establish a connection with your audience at this point. When you're giving a poster as opposed to a talk, you're right next to the person. You're having a one-on-one or maybe one-on-a-couple person interaction. I like to sort of start off this kind of gauge interest and, start maybe with a question like, well, have you seen anything about this topic in the news recently? Or have you ever heard that this is an issue? Or what do you find interesting about this? Just to kind of gauge where they are with their level of interest and their knowledge, so I have a better idea of how I'm going to proceed through the poster. We want to avoid weak intros, things like apologizing or making a joke or posing kind of a more rhetorical question. There's a very different effect of a rhetorical question and a question where you're trying to gauge your audience's level of knowledge on your topic. And one is much stronger than the other. Again, in this middle section where we go through our methods and our results and our interpretation, we really want to hone in on just a few key points that we can come back to, we can make sure that we're conveying clearly. It's really important to think about how you're going to transition between those different parts of your story and to practice those and go through them so your presentation isn't choppy or you don't get caught up. Part of this also is, if you're in a group, making sure that you've delegated beforehand how the group is going to move through that presentation. Again, showing is better than telling. You have this big, beautiful poster behind you that you've worked really hard on making clean and making look nice. You want to let the imagery on that poster speak. The data that you've collected and worked with is really the star of this presentation, and so you want to show the audience, not just tell them. Then, now that we've started strong, we also finish strong. So we want to summarize, set the final stage, and make sure we're consistent with that tone. What is the big takeaway? You want to share your insights about your project. You don't just want to present a number and then let the audience kind of interpret that as they may. Your insight is valuable. You've worked with these data for a long time. Your group has really thought about what these data mean. And so it's important to share that because it's a key part of your takeaways from this project and can really open up for a good conversation about your data after. And we want to make sure we don't just trail off. A good way to kind of signify that you're done with the main part of your poster presentation is transitioning into saying something like, do you have any questions? Or what's your thought on this conclusion I've drawn? And so you can signal to the audience that you're done with the main part of speaking and you're not just kind of mumbling off and hoping that they realize that you're finished.
Thanks, Clarice. So building off of this idea of telling a story and using your component parts, thought it would be a good idea just to draw your attention back to the Globe Symposia rubric. Because just like we as scientists get to send our work off for peer review, the students will have the opportunity to experience that idea of peer review through their poster presentation. And some of these things that are important for the creation of the poster can also be important to keep in mind for the delivery of the poster. So clear and focused objective is something that should be stated on the poster, but also something that can be conveyed to the audience while you're giving your presentation, and might be something that students can use to help them get started, because it is always intimidating to get started. Well-defined variables and a research plan and the research methods. Again, this is something that as you're conveying your methods as part of your story, you want to make sure that you define the component parts of it. So again, this rubric is really just reiterating and adding a little more detail to this idea of a story setup. Again, the appropriate use of graphs and stats. This is going to help them show the story and not just say it. So the data shown in an appropriate way will be very strong support to what the students are saying, and is also a criteria that the peer reviewers will be looking for. The discussion and conclusion, where you're putting findings into context, explaining sources of error, and citing things correctly, is again another guide for your proper story setup. I also wanted to draw your attention to the presentation, which has its own criteria, with clear and thoughtful responses to questions, and I'll go over a little bit more ways to prep for questions later on, and also understanding the basic science relevant to the project. So this is something that your students can keep in mind when constructing their story arc or their presentation. And also, I wanted to point out that an area of excellence that students can be awarded for demonstrating exemplary work is communication. So they can and actually could be rewarded for an impressive and exemplary communication of their work through the poster.
We're going to move into some quick do's and don'ts of giving a poster presentation. I figured we get the don'ts out of the way first so we can end on a more positive do these things. So some just general guidelines of giving a poster presentation. You don't want the main part of your poster presentation to be too long. I would say maximum about 5 minutes. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 minutes is probably a little bit better, just to not overwhelm the person you're talking to, and so you can transition into that really great exchange of question and answer and kind of getting deeper into your interpretations after you've delivered the main part of your presentation. You want to encourage students to think about not speaking too quickly, and they will speak more quickly when they are giving their poster presentation than they do when they practice, because they will be nervous. So, you want to feel like you're speaking too slowly almost, because you're probably speaking at about your normal pace while you're trying to quell those nerves a little bit. Also, not speaking too quietly. Often poster presentations are in large rooms filled with dozens and dozens of posters, and so you're going to need to project, because there's going to be a lot happening all over. A don't that I have learned the hard way is you do not want to wear uncomfortable shoes. Your students will be standing for a long time, and if they don't feel physically comfortable, it will show in their presentation. A lot of these presentations will be given in groups, and you don't want to have one person doing all of the talking. So through your prep work and thinking about how to deliver, students should be thinking about who's going to do what sections, or will we be switching off throughout the poster session, and have that prepared already. When you're speaking to someone at your poster, you don't want to turn your back to the audience, because you lose connection with them when you stop physically looking at them. It's kind of a cutoff of that conversation. And one way to navigate not turning your back to the audience is really trying not to read directly off your poster or notes. Having notes is fine, but trying not to rely on them because you're looking down the whole time. And again, really not connecting with the audience. You want students to be careful of filler words like, like, so. Makes you sound like you haven't prepared or maybe don't know what you're talking about. Kiley will talk about a few strategies to work on kind of eliminating the use of these filler words and how you can encourage students to think about working on that skill. Also, don't want to be afraid to answer a question with I don't know. It is okay to admit that you don't know the answer to something if you really don't know it. And you shouldn't be afraid to be honest if you don't know something. But overall, students shouldn't be doubting themselves during this poster presentation. They did the work, they know their project, probably better than anybody else in that room, unless somebody else magically did the exact same project they did. Nervousness does not show as much as we think it does, but a lack of self-confidence really does. The person that your student is speaking with is not going to know their personal habits. They don't know what they look like in a relaxed conversation, so they wouldn't know if they're nervous. But you can tell when somebody doesn't feel confident. Your students have worked on these posters and these projects for a long time. They've honed in their key points and thought about how they're going to deliver the message, and it's time to do it confidently. And for some do's for giving a poster presentation, we do want to both prepare and practice what students are going to say. We'll talk about that preparation and practice a little bit more after this slide. Reiterating speaking clearly and slowly, speaking more slowly than you think you should, because you're probably going to be a little nervous. Students really should be focusing on making eye contact with the person they're speaking with. It's a conversation, and eye contact is really key to establishing a connection, engaging if the person that you're speaking to is understanding what you're saying and trying to convey. Again, using data to tell the story, showing, not just telling. Have notes in case students need them. And generally, if you have prepared notes, you're going to be more confident with what you're saying anyways, because you've done the work to think through how you're going to present that data. And then you have those notes in case you get flustered, you have a tie line there to use. Again, students should really be focusing in on key points and really having a key central message. This is also a time for students to show their enthusiasm. They're probably excited about showing off what they've done over the course of this project. And it's exciting to see students succeed. And so this is a time to show off enthusiasm. And really, again, thinking of this presentation as a conversation, as communication. And communication is an area that they can be scored excellently in. Overall, this is a time to reiterate to your students that this is fun. It's a time to show off what they've learned and they've accomplished. Public speaking isn't necessarily comfortable for all students, but this is a time to really, be proud of what you've done. So they should be enjoying this time and feeling comfortable with the amount that they've prepared so they can relax a little bit.
And some of that preparation starts farther ahead than maybe you would think. About a month before the presentation, it's a really good time for students to start practicing presenting information to an audience. Now, I don't expect that they'll have full posters or even all of their data collected, because goodness knows, 4 weeks before my poster presentation, I'm not ready to give my poster presentation. But about a month before I have to give a big presentation, I will start finding ways to get myself presenting, whether that's volunteering to give a lecture or volunteering to talk about some of my research at a lab meeting, because it gets me in the brain space of delivering information. For students, this is also a very good way to identify habits that they might have while presenting. Things like saying, clicking your tongue. Some people tend to shift around a lot or use filler words. There are lots of different habits, and everyone has their own. I have my own myself. But if you start identifying habits early, you can also start to address them. One thing that I like to do is to find an accountability buddy. So this might be a friend in the class, my lab partner, a group mate, and I have them help me improve on whatever it is that I'm trying to improve before my presentation. So I tend to use as a filler. And if I'm presenting, I'll have my accountability buddy keep track of how many times I say And sometimes just seeing that number really shocks you into the reality of how often you're using a filler word. Often it makes you think about it a little more, and that slows you down, because sometimes you use filler words because you haven't quite thought through your complete sentence. You get halfway through and you have to fill for time. So learning to take a pause instead of continuing the noise is something that students can develop. And it's important to start early, because this is not something you want to try and address the day before a presentation, because you will be nervous, and these are comfortable habits, and it's just too much to try and ask someone overnight to change the way that they speak. So this is something really good to start doing 3 to 4 weeks before the presentation. A week or two before the presentation, if you can, print out a rough draft of the poster. You can even do this by printing out multiple 8x11 cards on just printer paper and posting them together. Sort of makes a collage of the poster. Alternatively, you could just project the PowerPoint on a wall and have a student stand near it. You could also set up a class poster walk to practice presenting and giving feedback. So the poster walks I've been on, each student who's giving a poster, or a group of students, will set up their poster or the projection of their poster. And as a class, you'll walk from poster to poster. And when you get to the poster that is yours, it's your turn to give a presentation. And so you will turn and give your presentation to the class, and everyone else will listen and give feedback. This could either be feedback in the moment or feedback anonymously later on a form that goes to the teacher, who can then sort through it and pass it back to the presenter. This is also a great place to find typos in your poster, because as the person who created the poster, often you've read it too many times and you just won't be able to see that typo. But someone who's coming up to your poster for the first time might be able to see it more easily. So something like this gets kids more comfortable being in that poster environment, and it also gives them an example of what someone who does well or doesn't do so well in a poster talk might be. 1 to 2 weeks out is another great time to brainstorm possible questions you might get from the audience and start thinking about your answers ahead of time. So again, if you do a poster walk or some sort of sharing in the posters, encourage students to ask questions, because these might be the same questions that they get from fellow students or from scientists that come to hear about their project. It's also a good idea for students to think of their own questions. I do this every single time I give a talk or a poster. I try and make a list of at least 10 questions I think someone might ask me, and I answer the ones that I can, and I star the ones that I can't, and I know I need to do a little more research. I need to think this through a little bit more, because if someone asked me that question, I wouldn't be able to answer it. And that's okay, because we're still 1 to 2 weeks away from the presentation. It's the best time to not know the answer. There's plenty of time to figure out an answer to a question. So I encourage that at least a week in advance. The final week before the presentation, practice. Practice the poster on as many different people as you can. Family members, other classes, someone walking down the hall, your neighbor next door, really anyone you can get. Especially practice on people who aren't already familiar with the topic, because it's in that moment that you'll see where some areas of clarity are and where some areas that might not be quite as clear or as smooth are. This will also get you practice answering lots of different questions. The question your mom asks you might be different than the question a peer asks you, or another teacher, or someone else in your group. So encouraging questions This helps to take some of the fear out of answering questions after, because it's not as scary when it's not high stakes. You're just in the class, you're just talking. And it also opens you up to a lot of different perspectives. Another thing I like to do, or make sure I've done by the final week, is think about future work for this project and things that you might do differently if you were going to go back and do it again. Because this is something good to convey, especially in the conclusion, when you're talking about directions for the project in the future, as Clarice had mentioned before. And often a question that gets asked is there anything you would do differently? Or what would you tell someone who's gonna start the same project? What would you tell them? What advice would you give them? So this is something that students can think about far in advance. And it means that when that question, if it does come up, arises, they've thought it through. And it's not as intimidating because they feel prepared. The day of the presentation is so exciting. So it's really hard, but it's a good idea to try and stay relaxed and enjoy. Set your poster up ahead of time so you can take a walk, get some water, shake out nervous energy. Often I will take laps of the poster hall before it's my time to set up and give my presentation. I tend to get a little jittery, and so getting a little exercise really helps calm me down. Also, especially if it's going to be a warm environment, you could bring a small bottle of water with you in your note cards to the poster area. And this is something you want to be careful of. You don't want to be glugging water while you're trying to give your presentation. So small bottles that can kind of be tucked away down by the feet where they're not going to get in the way and they're not going to be a distraction are great, because in between different visitors, you can take a sip of water, remember to breathe, because all of this is definitely high, it can be high anxiety, but also high excitement. At the end of your poster presentation, you will probably get asked questions. Take a second and make sure you understood what the person asked you. It's okay if you need to pause and really think about the question before you answer it. It's common. It's not anything bad to have to stop and think. It's also, if you're unsure, not a bad idea to rephrase the question and ask it back to them, or say, what I understand you're asking is X, Y, and Z, and that makes sure that you're on the same page before you continue on your explanation. Because sometimes when I've said, what I think you're asking is X, Y, and Z, they will say, oh no, I'm actually only asking Y. And then you can change your answer accordingly. When you're answering questions from the audience, make eye contact. Smile if it feels natural. I'm not telling you have to smile, but know that they're just there because they are excited. If they're asking questions, it means they were engaged and they want to learn more. So they're not trying to catch you out in anything. They're really just interested. And like Clarice said, it really is okay to admit not knowing the answer. Maybe it's future work that you've thought about but you haven't had time to do. Or maybe it's something you've never thought about and you can say, wow, that is very interesting. I had not thought of that before. Like, thank you so much for bringing up that question. Because you're not expected to know everything. And that is the end with that. This is the link to the SRS webpage that you can access. And we are now open for Q&A. If I can find out how to open it. That?
Let me hit the chat.
Yeah.
Great. There we go.
Does anybody have any questions? And could you both introduce yourselves briefly and just talk about your research areas and just the quick
That one over.
summary?
Go ahead, Clarice.
Sure. So again, my name is Clarice Perryman. I'm in the Earth and Environmental Science PhD program at the University of New Hampshire. My research focus is thinking about how climate change is changing carbon dynamics in northern wetlands, particularly in areas in the subarctic where there is permafrost that is thawing in response to warming and potentially releasing a lot of carbon in the form of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere.
Very cool. And I'm Kiley Remiszewski. I am an NRESS PhD student as well. My work focuses on this complex system of symbiotic fungi called mycorrhizal fungi and how they interact with different trees and the rocks in the soil, and how these mushrooms help trees eat rocks. And I'm also interested in how complex systems are thought about by students and by teachers. So thinking about how can we present complex systems in a way that is engaging for students and easily digested, which is a little bit hard.
Thank you. And Tracy does have a question. So,
can you provide the teachers the top 5 things? Oof. All right, what do you think? What are your top 5?
What are my top 5? Okay.
Yeah.
My personal top 5 are, in no particular order, speaking slowly and clearly, also speaking loudly enough, because in my experience at large meetings, the poster hall is loud. Really honing in on key points and not getting too hung up on all of the little nuances in your main part of your presentation. That's what the Q&A is for. Really thinking about using the graphs on your poster strategically and making sure your poster is showing those main points so you can show and tell. And also practicing. If anything, practice, 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 because you will work out the bumps in the road on your volume, your speed, and clarity. You'll really hone in on your tone and key message if you practice.
And those are pretty much my top 5 with extra emphasis on early preparation. So start a week earlier than you think you'd have to start and practice twice as much as you think you'd have to practice, because when you get in the hall and your adrenaline's running, that extra practice really does help calm you down and helps you deliver a better presentation.
I like how you mentioned, Kiley, that it's not necessarily that they're practicing presenting their poster at that time, but just presenting almost anything or maybe pieces of the poster. For instance, if they worked on a graph, maybe presenting that to somebody else. Would that?
Absolutely. Maybe they found a news article over the weekend that was really interesting and they present it to the class. Anything that gets them up in front of an audience talking, where people have to listen to them, where they can feel a little bit of pressure of delivering to an audience, and where they can start to identify some habits they might have that they might want to work on.
And presenting works in progress is a really common practice when trying to prepare how you're going to present your research. Like Kiley was saying, maybe showing a graph or showing maybe bullet points of the 3 key points. And that way, while students are developing their poster, they can not only be practicing presenting information, they can be getting feedback from their peers and from their teachers about the development of their work.